Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satka. I lead a project at the University of Witwatersrand called Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene. This webinar today is being hosted by the EFS. The EFS is really about trying to figure out how do we deal with the heating world. We have various research thrusts in this program. We look at climate temporality and how our world is being changed by climate, including seasonality, including what's coming in terms of climate science. We look at decolonial futures. We look at emancipatory futures in history, systemic pathways into the future, grand ecocentric futures, and utopia and dystopia. The current sort of context in which we're having today's webinar is also very, very apposite. Jenty, also for your benefit, we've just had a few towns, smaller towns in the province of KwaZulu-Natal being hit by two devastating tornadoes. We've had a lot of flooding in parts of the country right now, and some extreme weather, snowfalls, etc. This particular webinar is a follow-up on one we had a month or two ago as part of a conference with colleagues in Brazil and other parts of the world, a conference on disasters in the world system. And we've had great input, including from the South African panel around the rain bomb that hit Durban in 2021, the long drought we had in South Africa, circa 2014 till about 2021, water crises we've had in the country, and so on. So today we are really fortunate to have with us talking on learning from disasters for the future, Jenty Kirsch-Wood. Jenty joined the UN for disaster risk reduction and is the head of the global risk analysis and reporting part of that. She served as the UNDP Deputy Resident Representative in Kazakhstan and advised Vietnam and Nepal on climate change and disaster resilience issues. She also served as the Disaster and Climate Change Policy Focal Point for UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She has nearly 20 years' experience working with UN agencies and non-governmental organizations in Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kenya, and Somalia. Essentially, Jenty's been very grounded, and she holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's degree from Harvard University. Jenty and I are also part of the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, which was launched earlier this year. And it's lovely to have you, Jenty, with us here in South Africa. Jenty, please, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be joining you, unfortunately, just virtually from a sunny Geneva. But I think that, as you outlined, Vishwas, these issues could not be more timely, and they could not be more timely for our global community. I think we're now in a situation where disaster risk reduction is really everybody's business. And it's really critical that we leverage what we know about disasters and that we're able to better learn from the past to inform the future. If I may, can you see, I'm now that I've put the slides on display mode, I can't unfortunately see if they're showing. Are we good to go?
No, they're not showing on our end.
They're not good to go. Okay, let me try one more time. Excuse me. The best laid plans. Let's try this. Share.
Yes, it's coming through. Yes, it's come through. Thank you. Except we can't hear you. You got to unmute, Jenty. Okay. You got to unmute. All right. Now you muted
again. Can you hear me okay? Are we good to go?
Now we're good to go. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, excuse me. Sorry, I'm benefiting from trying to do this a little bit on the fly outside of my office with a newly upgraded laptop from this morning. Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk you through a little bit, just some thinking about how the disaster risk reduction community sees the construction of risk and some of the thoughts and options about what we might be able to do about it. If you like, the raison d'etre from the Sendai framework is really to look at identifying and managing risk. And the Sendai framework is a global agreement similar to, for example, the Paris Agreement, or it's an internationally agreed global instrument that attempts to really manage the risk of small scale, large scale, frequent and infrequent, sudden and slow onset disasters caused by natural or man-made hazards as they relate to environmental, technological, biological hazards and risks. So as you can see, it's a pretty wide mandate, and it's really a moment for us as a community to come together and say, well, if we've got this framework for managing disaster risk, how do we do that in the most effective manner? I'm now seeing that it's gonna slow me way down. Okay, great. And when we're talking about risk, what are we talking about? From the disaster risk reduction perspective, risk is really about a hazard, about vulnerability, and about exposure, and the combination of those three things. And the reason, and that essentially risk equation has been recognized both within the disaster risk reduction community, but also in the climate change community. And it's important because in my view, that's part of the key to unlocking how we can begin to better manage risk, because only managing hazards will not reduce our future risk. But if we look at how we can manage underlying vulnerability and exposure, we have a much better chance. And so when we talk about hazards, we talk about, for example, floods, storms, droughts. They don't need to become disasters. But it's clear that what climate change is doing is that for the first time in human history, we have been able to, through our anthropogenic actions, to actually increase the frequency and intensity of hazards. And what that means is the goalposts have moved, right? We can no longer rely on the past to be a fully accurate vision for the future, but it's also clear that we need to absolutely evolve and adjust how we operate, but learning from what we used to know how to do, and if you like, taking it to the next level. Now, if hazards are, is it raining today? Vulnerability is about, are you getting wet, right? Do you have an umbrella? Are you able to protect yourself? And exposure is really about, exposure is about, are you getting wet? And vulnerability is about, if you're getting wet, why are you getting wet? But what's clear is that vulnerability around the world is also increasing in aggregate, but is very, very regionally specific, and even within societies, extremely locally specific. So you might have the same city where certain people who are more wealthy have more access to better land and better resources, are not at high flood risk, but others may be. And I think in the South African context, you would have many, many examples of that combination of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. But what is also clear is that in the context of climate change, and also in the context of socioeconomic processes, we see risk compounding, and it begins to compound and it begins to cascade in quite interconnected ways. So again, where 30 years ago, perhaps people would say, okay, well, if we can provide a better flood defense system, we feel that we have managed the hazard effectively. Right now, we need to look much more about how more complicated systems are interacting. And what we see is that there are many non-hazard related factors, such as failing infrastructure, food insecurity, challenges to biodiversity that may not be the direct result of the hazard at all, but which are in fact continuing to drive vulnerability and exposure to increase. And if we don't address some of those underlying drivers like poverty or like urban development planning, there's no way that we will really be able to reduce the disasters of the future. And another way of thinking about this is as essentially looking at the cascading and the systemic impacts of hazards, and the fact that hazards are now interacting, and you may even have multiple hazards to create things that are, if you like, multiple and compound systemic disasters. For example, multiple breadbasket failure, and some of the complex interactions we saw during the COVID pandemic, or during the food price spikes in the wake of energy price rises as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see much more that the idea of being able to, quote, isolate the idea of a natural disaster no longer works in our complex world. And so when we talk about risk science, I think it's really important to understand that it's complex and that it's varied. And what that means is that you can't predict the future, but you can begin to understand trends and lines of complexity and variety that are going to help us be more agile and more flexible in how we approach risk in the future. Because you have to be able to start breaking down what are the stressors, what are the mitigating factors, but also what are the risks of a systemic failure, and then work back from that into how do you approach development and how do you approach sustainability in quite a different way. Sustainable development is no longer just the product of, if you like, economic and social policy. It really also needs to be a reflective and creative, continuous management of our complex risk future. So for you as young scientists, social or otherwise, I really want to stress there's not one way to practice risk science, but instead I want to leave you with three perhaps things to think about as you begin to look at perhaps your future research or the future direction of how you can perhaps further sustainable development and social development in whatever path you choose. And the first point I want to make is that, in my view, learning how to manage risk is perhaps the development question of our time. And I say that because if we cannot risk inform human and social science, applied science, natural science, the development of technology, the use of artificial intelligence, if we cannot begin to manage the risks in those processes, I don't believe that continued sustainable development in the traditional sense of the last 50 years of the post-war environment will be possible. The complexity and the frequency and the intensity of risk, as Vishwas was reminding us at the beginning of the session, is simply too big. It can't be ignored anymore. And we see that also that it impacts pretty much every sector. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a tendency to say, oh, well, you know, this is a health emergency and we need to just rely on WHO. Now, 2 years into the pandemic, it was very, very clear that it was not only a health emergency. It had economic impacts, it had social impacts, it had mental health impacts, it had impacts on supply chain, it had impacts on virtually every element of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when we talk about integrated development, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity to get better at understanding these systemic connections and being able to look through how we can create sustainability, equity, and efficiency in how we manage those risks and prevent disasters, not only respond to them. But if we look at COVID as a short-term shock, we also are very clear that we are facing long-term systemic shocks, such as the future impacts of climate change, that even if we are succeeding in balancing and reducing greenhouse gases, which we definitely should be doing, for generations to come, we will be seeing those impacts play out in a warmer world and in a world which has more volatile and extreme events. And so at the same time that we're getting better at, if you like, or we need to get better at managing those one-off shocks and preventing the escalation of hazards, we also need to be developing the day-to-day ability to adjust our status quo, to take into account some of these longer-term trends, and to essentially build forward. It's no longer appropriate just to build back better in the old traditional phrase. We now need to be, if you like, building forward better, to be thinking about what is the world going to look like in 2050, what is the world going to look like in terms of water, in terms of resources, and what can we do to restore soils, to make ecosystems as effective and resilient as possible for, unfortunately, what will be some unavoidable shocks at this point. And if you need any further convincing of that, and perhaps with this audience you don't, you may want to take a look at a piece of work we did last year, which is called the Global Assessment Report of 2023. I can put the link in the chat. And we just did some very simple work about looking at, for example, issues around increasing drought risk under a 1.5 climate change scenario and the relationship that that would have to food insecurity. And then looking at that same map under a 2-degree scenario. And for those living in your region, I think there's no surprise that you should be concerned very much about the increase in that dark food insecure potential. But again, I think the point here is also to recognize that that's not a done deal. There are tools that we have that can begin to reverse this trend. And of course, that's partly through reducing greenhouse gases, but it's also about doing things like ecosystem regeneration, managing soil and water better, reducing water loss. But it's utterly critical that we build that into every sector of our work into the future. Because if we don't use this information and these pointers that we have, we really risk getting stuck in a spiral of response that is increasingly ineffective and increasingly reinforcing rather than reducing vulnerability and inequity. And the second point I want to raise is that technology will only get us so far in this. And what I mean by that is we can use tools like risk modeling. We can use tools like innovation to improve our ability to understand risk and to address it. But at the same time, we need to look at some of the social systems. We need to look at some of the community knowledge. We need to look at some of the people-focused elements that will enable us to transition. It's essential that these discussions happen in a participatory way. It's essential that we look at what we can do to strengthen grassroots understanding about how the world is changing, and also learn from those communities about how they've managed previous risks and how we can potentially create the right kinds of futures. A technological focus will not be as easy to replicate, translate, and to scale up if it isn't owned by communities and isn't co-created to be context specific. And the other thing is that a technological approach can also be too siloed. And one of the things that is fascinating about the era that we're entering is that the idea of a sectoral approach becomes increasingly impossible to be effective. It's really clear that we need multiple groups of people solving these problems, and not only because that's more effective in terms of how individuals solve problems, but also because almost all of these issues are multi-sectoral. I work, for example, a lot with the insurance industry, and they're increasingly realizing that while they're very good at modeling certain types of financial risk, if they don't get better at understanding, for example, changes in demographics, changes in social patterns, but also changes in hazards with different types of stakeholders, they won't have a business model in the same way that they did 20 years ago. And so that issue to work across silos and create solutions is going to be really core at all levels. And so I think we need to move not only from a multidisciplinary, but if you like, almost to a transdisciplinary approach that doesn't look for one particular solution, but at the same time looks to identify what is working and to help different stakeholders at all levels be part of those sorts of decisions. And there are examples where we see positive progress. There's the Great Wall Initiative in the Sahel region was really developed as an attempt to move across some of the silos that had been separating food security, humanitarian relief, from agriculture, from infrastructure investment. And this was really an attempt to look at the challenge of desertification and soil erosion, long-term into restoring and reversing land degradation, not only managing the impacts of the problem, but actually getting to a root cause. And I think if we can also learn from more of those kinds of approaches, we stand a much better chance of being able to accelerate risk reduction, which is so essential for our future. But the final point that I want to make is we cannot eliminate risk entirely. It's absolutely essential that we get better at managing risk, because we cannot, we need to get better at realizing we live in an uncertain world. It is interconnected. It is able to be understood in terms of potential trends and potential results, but it is not possible to create a technological model of the future that is accurate enough to put a number on where we will be in 2030 in a way that anyone who is a reasonable scientist would probably stand behind. And what that means is that as we're looking at these risk-informed systems, we need to be looking for agility, flexibility, and learning as key components of those systems. It's not, you can never write a manual in PDF anymore. It's going to need to be something that is continually evolved and co-created. And so I just want to end by saying risk science is fundamental to addressing the climate crisis and to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's central to beginning to have a more sustainable approach to development, and that's not necessarily growth in the way that we have thought of it previously. But it's also important that we begin to really learn from past events. And we can see here, for example, that we need to look at each event that happens. We need to try and understand what is the disaster DNA that has led to that event, what is really specific about what happened in terms of vulnerability, exposure, and the hazards. We need to then create the kinds of solutions that particularly look at what were those elements of vulnerability and exposure in particular that can be understood, that can be dissected. And then we need to look at those in the context of what is the future trajectory? What is the, if we're looking at, for example, high rates of particularly poor people who happen to have nomadic livelihoods, who are being really hit by a particular type of hazard, where is that going to be going in 20 years? Where is that going to be going for 30 years? And we need to apply, if you like, a future filter to make sure that if we're looking at sustainable development approaches for those communities, they're going to be fit for that climate future. And so to sum up, I just want to underscore, it is essential that our generation and even more your generation needs to put a premium on developing and delivering on a resilient future. And doing that is going to require linking a concept of foresight explicitly to risk reduction action and to long-term planning that looks both across the public and private sector. It's going to require investing in comprehensive and coordinated systemic risk assessments that really try and understand where vulnerability and exposure can be reduced to better manage uncertain hazard future. And it's going to require things like working across different parts of government, but also the banking sector and with the private sector to stress test and better disclose the risk that they have across people, planet, and prosperity, but also to plan and be required to plan to safeguard the stability of future generations. And doing that is going to require fast tracking integrated disaster risk management into sustainable development and climate action. But it's also going to be able to make, it's also going to require recognizing that preventing disasters is a shared responsibility and a right, and that people need to be at the heart of that disaster prevention through an all of society approach that can really be empowering of the most vulnerable and can create a sustainable future for all. So I hope that gives some thought and some perspectives for further discussion, but I very much look forward to questions, suggestions, and feedback from the group. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jenty. That was so thought-provoking and stimulating. Okay, we have 30 participants, and some of you are clearly students and also from beyond the university, because we made this a public webinar. So yeah, if you have a comment or question, I haven't been tracking the chat, But if you have a comment or question, please put up your hand. Yes, Marcus, please go ahead. Marcus Solomon. Charles, can Marcus speak? Does he have Marcus, just unmute.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you, Vish. Yeah, I'm Marcus Solomon from the Children's Resource Center. I've been involved with the building of the children's movement for the last 40 years. We are a member of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, the Climate Justice Forum movement. And we've had some experience with disaster management and children. Even before climate, all the hype about climate emerged, in our communities for many years, especially in the Western Cape, communities were subjected to floods, etc. So in a small way, we've involved children as active participants in addressing the risk and the dangers involved. So just in terms of the point you raise about vulnerability, I think children have been shown to be most vulnerable in floods, fires, etc., etc. The heat. So our approach is that children should be actively involved in managing the risk. A simple example, the issue of access to the internet, to be alerted to the floods emerging, etc. So my question is, how do you respond to the issue of children being actively involved in risk management processes and mechanisms and systems? Yeah.
Thank you, Marcus. Over to you, Jenty.
Yeah, no, thank you, Marcus, for the question. And I think that, no, it's a really beautiful example of where we really need to look at all of society approaches. And often young people of many ages, actually, first of all, are often some of the most forward-looking in terms of understanding the potential challenges of the future. And if you look at the demographics of groups who are actively pushing for action around climate, young people and children are some of the highest ranking people on those lists. And so they really are, I don't want to say they're our hope for our future, because we shouldn't step back ourselves, but it's really clear that they are giving us a mandate, first of all, for strong action. But I think your point is even more profound, which is that, yeah, they are also change agents. And I think there are beautiful examples from around the world. I spent quite a bit of time in Vietnam, and it was quite common there for young people who had higher literacy rates, higher rates of mobile phone penetration, to be really essential in the early warning systems for things like extreme weather. And they were often able to translate into local languages or into essentially, subnational languages for their parents. They were able to bring risk reduction messages home. They were able to help disseminate early warnings. And I think that's really essential. I also think it's really important that we recognize that by understanding how particular groups, and that not all children are universally equally vulnerable, we can begin to also understand different elements of where systems might need particular strengthening in certain types of events. And by that, I mean, for example, children with disabilities, or children who may have certain types of learning difficulties, or children who are living in particularly unsafe homes. What I usually find is if you can design a disaster response project for some of those smaller groups, it's pretty much going to cover everyone else while at the same time. But the process of thinking through some of those people who may be at the extreme end of need, or the extreme end of vulnerability, usually improves the level of effectiveness and efficiency for everyone. So couldn't agree with you more. And it sounds like you've got some excellent work going. And I'm so happy to hear that those networks are strong and getting stronger. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Lovely.
Thank you. Before I bring in other comments or questions, I'm just going to sound you off on a few other things, Jenty. Just in terms of the Sendai framework, which seems to be the kind of linchpin around disaster management and risk approaches. Can you just tell us a little bit about, what does this mean for governments when they kind of, lock into this framework? What are they meant to do, etc.? And where's the best work happening around taking forward the Sendai framework, and what can we learn from those examples?
Wow, it's a great question and a broad one, and I'm very happy to provide some links and some resources after this, and also really I want to be very humble here in saying that UNDRR doesn't do the risk reduction work, right? This is done by governments, communities, stakeholders around the world. We might help, hopefully, facilitate and accelerate it, but that great work is happening globally. In terms of the framework, however, there are 4 priorities. And I think, in my view, the 4 priorities of action are pretty good guideposts for if you've got a program that isn't addressing those things, that may be a bit of an issue. And the first one is really, are you understanding the risk? And I've talked a lot today about how you might do that. And you need to do that in an integrated way, looking across the hazard, the vulnerability, and the exposure. But the second thing is you need to look at the governance mechanisms behind that to really get something to be sustainable and owned. And when I talk about governance, I'm not only talking about the people that you hopefully vote for, but I'm also talking about like how communities are organized, who's engaged, is it participatory, who's at the table, right? You need to be looking at what are those governance arrangements, and are they the right kinds of systems to really be helpful. And then the third thing is really looking at, are you investing in the right areas, right? Are you really investing either in terms of human or in financial capacity to actually reduce the root causes of those risks? Because if you're only throwing the money after the problem's happened, you're not going to really begin to chip away at vulnerability and exposure. So that issue of investment and investing for resilience is that third priority of Sendai. And then the final one is trying to look at those preparedness capacities, trying to look forward and say, if we learned from this last event, are we prepared for that next one? And we used to say building back better, but now I think we need to say building forward better. Have we learned from what we know from recent disasters? And are we able to imagine a future when we may have a more extreme event or a more uncertain event? And could we be able to pivot and address that kind of risk? So those are those 4 key priorities of the Sendai framework. And I tend to find that if you think about those 4 elements when you're thinking about how you might want to manage risk, whether or not you're looking at a local child-centered program, or you're looking at advising a government on their investment decision making, it's not a bad set of signposts to get you moving in the right direction. I hope that helps answer the first part of your question. And where some of the greatest work is happening, in every region, there are some really exciting things happening. I think what you're seeing, for example, right now is much more risk reduction action happening in the climate change community. For a while, they were kind of separate. I think now we've moved beyond that. You see really quite interesting, innovative programs happening, for example, through the Early Warning for All initiative, which is trying to really increase the effectiveness of early warning systems around the world. You see huge strides in terms of strengthening, for example, seismic resilience and understanding how building code and land use planning choices can really improve the world. Oh, sorry, I got a little bit of background noise here. And there's some really nice innovations happening there. And the thing with disasters is, that ability, you look at countries like Bangladesh, who, in the 1970s lost over 200,000 people in a major cyclone. And now their population has increased, their urban development has spiraled, their economy has grown, and their disaster deaths have plummeted. They have really been incredibly effective in reducing mortality and in managing an incredibly complex risk landscape. So every continent has those sorts of examples. I'm happy to provide some more information. But I think one of the things that those projects have been able to do, or those initiatives have been able to do, is really address each of those 4 priority areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenty. So there's a comment from Shirley Walters. I'm interested in the learning from past and present disasters. Are there learning hubs or places where these lessons are being gathered, archived, so people can access them?
Yeah, the quick answer, the long answer to your question. There are tools like the Prevention Web website, which I think can be a really useful resource for looking at disaster risk reduction tools and experience and case studies from around the world. There's also a lot of sectoral information. For example, we put together a special report on drought in 2021, and that has 23 really interesting case studies about different types of disasters and how they've been managed in different contexts. But there's also increasing understanding around different resources around the world. At the same time, we're coming out with another special report later this year, which is specifically looking at something called the forensic disaster approach, which I referred to briefly in my presentation. And that's really been championed by the academic community, predominantly in Central America. So really experts, and I can provide you some of the references from University of Mexico, from some of the universities in Costa Rica, where they really developed a useful forensic approach that digs into some of the social context of risk and digs into some of the aspects of vulnerability and exposure. And I would very much, suggest that you may want to take a closer look at that. And we'll be coming out with a report just in the course of this summer, which is essentially distilling key elements of that approach and looking at 10 recent disasters, everywhere from the Horn of Africa to recent Mexican earthquakes, that is particularly exploring that forensic approach and what it can teach us about the future. So I hope that gives you a taste. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenty. Before I bring in someone else, I'm going to just pop another issue your way. So this whole issue of reconstruction and building forward that you mentioned, again, where are there kind of interesting sort of points of reference for that? And, where have we seen attempts to kind of reconstruct differently? So learning lessons, planning in for whatever people are anticipating as trends and so on, drawing on the forensic, maybe kind of learning, etc. Yeah, I don't know if you have some examples to share.
Yeah, no, I think that there's, a lot of that early learning came out of the earthquake and the tsunami-based learning, really looking more at seismic risk. And you can see through things like, for example, the Global Earthquake Model Foundation's work, how we've really learned, and actually some of the case studies coming out of the Nepal earthquake, NSET, national NGO, has really been incredibly good at documenting different ways that they have understood, both in traditional construction, but also in engineered construction, and been able to sort of learn from different events to improve seismic resilience in often quite low cost and replicable ways for local communities on relatively low resources. But where I think some of the most interesting work is now beginning to happen is in translating that same kind of forensic learning into things like land use planning. And there were initiatives that were begun in places like the Netherlands, but also in places like Vietnam, where people began to look at the concept of living with floods and move away from a flood control, if you like, command and control approach that was trying to zero out flood risk, and instead was trying to recognize the recurrent nature of the flood risk, and if you like, adapt and plan to live with that. And so you have cities like Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where large parts of the city are technically under sea level, but they've actually designed urban structures to be able to cope with significant flooding 2-3 times a year. Similarly, if you look at how the Vietnamese, some of the coastal provinces have basically adjusted their agricultural patterns to be able to, again, really live with floods and recognize that a flooding cycle is not necessarily something to be fought against, but instead you can design around it. And there's been real development. And in China, you can actually see a lot of the national guidelines really being adjusted to require both more greenery, the removal of such large amounts of asphalts in city centers, so that cities are better able to become, if you like, more effective sinks for handling flood events. On the drought side, you have similar initiatives around urban regeneration, around, today is World Environment Day. And I spent this morning learning about some really interesting global programs, including here in Geneva, where I live, where there are real efforts to improve the greening of cities, to reduce the impact, for example, of urban heat stress, which is really a challenge for many, many parts of the world, where the number of days above 36 degrees or even 40 degrees is continually increasing, and design and learning from how do you create safe spaces for the most vulnerable populations, but also how do you design to minimize pockets of that extreme heat is really becoming a central planning issue rather than a luxury item for the architecture students. So I hope that gives you some sense, and I'm happy to provide some more references.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, there has been a request for a link from Shirley. Sizwe, I think he raises something about communities being ready for disaster management, which links to what Sargi Kistasamy is also asking. Is there a generic disaster management protocol that we can follow and adapt to localized disasters? So in other words, I mean, are there models, are there practices where communities have really kind of wrap their heads around risk, and they are busy kind of doing stuff to prepare, to organize, and deal with challenges around risk and disaster?
Yes, I mean, there certainly are. And I would definitely suggest as an early place to start, you might want to look at some things like the Red Cross Climate Center, because they have built, the Red Cross family, I'm guessing in South Africa, is probably quite active. And there's a long tradition of community-based disaster risk management programming, not only within the Red Cross, but, Oxfam, many of the NGOs, many of the local community groups. There are principles about knowing how to prepare for disasters that have been developed really over the last 50, 70 years. And those mechanisms have been quite good at creating, if you like, cells of local people who are able to identify the people who are most vulnerable, able to look at evacuation planning, able to look at the risk mapping in those in particular sublocal areas, and put some of the resources in place that can, when a shock happens, can adjust to that. Now, of course, the challenge is that that's often quite resource constrained. So you need sometimes external assistance. You need help to come in if it gets above the coping capacity of that community. But also, as I was touching on in my presentation, that one of the indignities of the climate crisis is that a lot of those systems have relied a lot on indigenous knowledge. And of course, one of the challenges of climate change is that it's throwing curveballs at all of us, right? And those curveballs are equally affecting the most sophisticated insurance models, but they're also in fact affecting the accuracy of indigenous knowledge. And so teams like the team at the Red Cross Climate Center have been trying to, look at how you can adjust some of those community-based methodologies to, again, become a little bit more agile and a little bit more flexible. But again, I think I do want to underscore this really has to operate at all levels. Yeah, you can't have government saying, we're just going to leave it all to communities. They need to be able to manage this alone. This is really something where you need to have, yes, very good community engagement. Yes, community-led efforts that really are locally grounded, but that also needs to be impacting development planning, fiscal planning, the role of the private sector. This is too big an issue just to be left, for individuals alone to feel responsible for. We really need an all of society approach.
Thanks. I'll come back to two comments. I just want to pick up on the one study you mentioned around food issues and climate and so on. Can you say a little bit more to us around how, using your vantage point, given the research you'll have done around the risks facing food systems? You can just elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I mean, food systems are a really beautiful example of, yes, there's a strong climate driver, right? There's a strong hazard driver. If there's not, but again, it's one that it's for a change in the rainfall to create food insecurity. There are a lot of moments in both the vulnerability construction and in the exposure construction where a disaster could have been prevented. Yeah. And increasingly, what we're seeing, and I think this is one of the really interesting things about looking at systemic risk, is that previously there was a tendency to think of food security as being directly related to food availability and food production within a particular geographic area. So if the harvest fails in this district, people will be hungry in this district. With globalization and with the change in how food systems have evolved, that really does not stand true anymore in any significant way. You have populations, for example, in parts of the east of your continent that have been really, and also in the west of Africa, that have been intimately, intermeshing their food security with suppliers in, for example, Ukraine and the eastern parts of Europe for 30 or 40 years. And so what you actually saw during the COVID crisis was spikes in food insecurity that had to do nothing with actual rainfall in those particular areas, but had to do with supply chain shocks. And those shocks only exacerbated with some of the geopolitical issues. And so you really need a more nuanced approach. You can't just say, oh, the rain went down, the harvest, people will be hungry. Now that's a challenge. That's also a great opportunity, because we can also use those same systems to build resilience in different ways. And of course, when you're looking at long-term food insecurity, it is one of the areas that we really need to think forward as a real matter of priority, because you also do have some longer term trends, like, for example, in soil degradation or in land degeneration, where if we don't invest in those resources, they simply will not be able to have the same functions they've had in our economies and our societies that they did 30 years ago. And we there's a beautiful quote from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, and it goes something like this. I hope I get it right. The land is our foundation, but we treat it like dirt. Yeah. Or the soil, and it's a beautiful sense of, if we don't get better at managing that ecosystem, the idea of having a food system that is going to be able to continue to sustain us is increasingly at risk. And that, again, is an area of real prioritization. So I hope that gets at some of the issues of the complexity and systemic nature of risk around food.
There'll be two final comments that we'll feel to you. The one was from Taole, and he or she's asking around, the link with climate, and maybe to elaborate this even more. I mean, we just came out of a national election, and I think there was a comment also made by Sergey. None of our political parties mainstream the climate issue at all. Complete disconnect from that issue. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned the climate community is now kind of, working on risk approaches and so on. But are there examples of governments that have really kind of mainstreamed this, have this all society approach, and so on and so on, vis-a-vis climate? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have, I think you're not alone in that frustration. I think there are many countries around the world that, and if you look at the global risk poll, the Lloyd's Register Risk Perception Survey, it's really striking how in all continents, in all regions, there is an interest in greater access on climate. And in pretty much all of those demographics at the same time, there's a significant portion of people who feel that their governments are not doing enough. At the same time, a lot is happening. And if you look at the green transition, over the last 20 years, I remember I began to work in this area about 20 years ago. And at that point, in order to handle the kind of energy transition, the technology simply did not exist. There was no way of finding your way out of a 2-degree world. With the developments and investments since that time, the price of a solar panel has fallen by more than 90%. And now we're quibbling over costs of 2-3% of GDP that could make this problem not go away, but really come into a manageable proportion. So first of all, don't lose hope, and a lot is happening. At the same time, it is amazing that some countries like Costa Rica, for example, had carbon taxes 30, 40 years ago on fossil fuels, and other countries are still unable to, put that on the table as a political discussion point. I think you're also seeing, real challenges within sectors like banking about actually accounting for the real costs of risk. And we consistently undervalue ecosystems. We continually don't take into account external costs. And so I really hope those are going to be some of the areas that the governments get their head around. But it is happening. And I see, particularly in, places, well, actually, no, in places like the G20, but also in, there are coalitions now of central banks that are really beginning to look at issues of climate disclosure. You look at some of the discussions around in the climate agreement about how you might get to more financial risk management approaches in an understanding of loss and damage, moving away from a very kind of siloed approach to a more sort of integrated approach. So I think there are those examples. I think you see, at the same time, I think it is challenging. It is very multifaceted. At the same, but in conclusion, what I would also note is that I now don't really know of a country that isn't trying something. So that's good. And we need to really reinforce that and increase the learning. And also within a lot of countries, while maybe at aggregate, things aren't quite where you'd want to be, I would bet if you look at certain elements within even within your context in South Africa, you can find some really quite exciting work that's going on, some really quite exciting developments and being able to look in a more integrated manner. And so if those sorts of things can get more centrally put forward as, effective, cost effective, and in good stead for future generations, the voices of people like that in this call and getting that message out, I think can be really powerful to leaders. Because right now, it used to be that I used to have to explain the why of why people should care about risk reduction a lot in my day-to-day work. Now I don't need to do that anymore. But what we need to do is more on the how and the what. And so I take the question very seriously. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenty. This is the final question we'll field to you. It comes from Sven Fortley. How can post-disaster migration be mitigated or alleviated by RR planning?
Yeah, I think that's very context specific. I think migration is, historically through millennia has been a really good coping strategy. So I don't think migration necessarily is something in our globalized world that should always be demonized. It's been very effective when people left Ireland during the potato famine and they sought better futures in some other countries, including the US. I think people looking back on that would be hard pressed to say that migration should have been stopped. It relieved a lot of suffering and it created a lot of new opportunities. At the same time, I think it is important, again, going back to understanding vulnerability, understanding exposure, and understanding choices, and understanding the opportunities that people have. And those same principles of consultation, but also understanding, what are locally sustainable options, that's got to be core to it. At the same time, it's also really true that if we're not good custodians of our ecosystems, we're going to have to find ways of addressing this really tricky issue. Because I know, I spent a lot of my childhood in the UK, and there are serious discussions now about certain parts of the coastline that local governments are saying we're not going to try and defend that community anymore. It's just too risk. The erosion is too high. The cost to maintain 2-3 houses, it's not sustainable anymore. These are difficult situations that we've made for ourselves. We need to reduce them, but we also need to not be afraid of them. We did some work, for example, in Fiji, really helping begin to look at how risk can be managed in a more integrated manner, and how different types of consent can be nurtured so that communities can really have a role in shaping some of those decisions moving forward. And I hope those kinds of things can be useful and built upon by governments more in the future.
Thank you so much, Jenty. Just three key points to underline before we all sort of disband. I mean, the first is clearly this cutting edge risk management and disaster approaches. Jenty and her team, the Sendai framework. There's a whole set of tools that we can look to and pull down and work with. I think the second thing is that it's happening. There's so many exciting examples from sectors to governments and so on. And again, we need to be looking and learning from that. I think the last point for me is that communities actually have a crucial role to play in the kind of risks and challenges we have to confront. And again, lots of learning on that front, lots of tools that can be pulled down for them and so on. This recording will definitely be shared with everybody, and a big thank you to you, Jenty, for making the time and sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and experience with us. Take care.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity, and really wishing you all the best, and hope to keep in touch. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.